Hey guys, so today we are going to be talking about the idea of culture shock in relation to what happens in A Long Walk to Water, chapters 13 through 14, specifically chapter 14 towards the end. So, just as a little bit of background information, when at the end of chapter 14, when we last see Salva, he has just found out that he is given the opportunity to come to America. So he's currently living in a refugee camp at this point, and his name pops up on the list, and he's getting an opportunity to come to America and kind of get out of South Sudan. So he will be leaving South Sudan behind and leaving Africa behind altogether to come to the United States. So keep in mind that Salva was only one of thousands of lost boys who sought refuge in the United States. Um, and so he was only one of thousands of people who left behind their home culture and came to the US. And we've already kind of talked extensively about the differences between US culture and South Sudanese culture. So we already know very well that the two cultures are very different and the ways of life in those countries are very different. So, with that, we are going to talk about this idea called culture shock. So, I have a quick definition here for you. I'll read it out loud. So, culture shock is the feeling of disorientation experienced by someone who is suddenly subjected to an unfamiliar culture, way of life, or set of attitudes. Many people who come to the United States experience some sort of culture shock. And really, anybody who experiences a new culture has the potential of experience culture shock. So, culture shock is basically when you go to a place where their way of life and the way they do things is different than what you're used to. So you can imagine that someone who has grown up in South Sudan all their life, like Salva and a lot of the Lost Boys, would be very shocked by the culture in the United States just because it's so different. They're not used to the way things are done in the United States. So, I wanted to talk to you guys about this diagram here. I think it does a really good job of illustrating culture shock and the cycle that is called the cultural adaptation cycle. So, lots of refugees, when they come to the United States, or really when anybody experiences a new culture, somebody might go through this cultural adaptation cycle. So you'll see that there are 5 different phases in this cycle, and I'm going to walk you through each 5 of those phases. So the first phase is called the honeymoon phase. And so what the honeymoon phase is it's when somebody is experiencing the culture for the very first time. So when the Lost Boys came to the US for the very first time, I'm sure they were very excited about the culture, um, excited about all the resources that were available to them. You know, they had food, they had water, they had shelter. Everything was very new and exciting to them. So it was kind of a positive feeling. The honeymoon phase. It's a really positive phase, and you could see it's kind of at the peak um, of our graph here. So that means it's a really good phase. And this is the first phase that many refugees experience when they come to a new country. But then, as we digress down the chart, we come to phase 2. So it's kind of lower on our chart, meaning it's a little bit more negative than phase 1. This is phase 2, and it's called the rejection phase. So, what the rejection phase is, it's when the realities of life can become overwhelming. Many things do not go according to plan, and refugees may feel misunderstood. So, when the Lost Boys came to the United States, they had people to help them. So, of course, they had somebody helping them get housing, they had somebody helping them find jobs, and they all had host families who were helping them and, kind of just showing them the ropes. But those people didn't stick around for the whole time they were living in the US. So eventually, the Lost Boys kind of had to become self sufficient and they had to start living in this new country themselves. So you can imagine that it was pretty overwhelming when they had to deal with this completely new and foreign culture and way of life that was so different from what they were used to. It can be really overwhelming. Think about like how overwhelmed you felt when we started doing online learning. It's just a big change when things change so quickly. So the rejection phase is pretty common, and it's kind of like the phase of being overwhelmed is how I like to remember it. And so then we move on to phase three. So you realize that phase three is at the lowest point on our diagram because phase three is kind of the lowest point for many people experiencing culture shock. So phase three is called the regression phase. And in order to deal with the stressful changes, a refugee may only try to surround himself with people of their own culture. And usually the reason they do this is because they want to surround themselves with people who are familiar to them. So, this new country that they're living in is already so unfamiliar. They're dealing with so many new changes that they kind of try to overcompensate by just hanging around and being with people that they're familiar with and that are familiar with their home culture. So, it's kind of like a coping mechanism to all of these changes and that overwhelming feeling that a lot of refugees experience. So, phase three is kind of the lowest phase on the cultural adaptation cycle. And from there on, things start to look up. So, phase four is called the recovery phase. So, if a person can work through phase three down here, if they can be successful and keep pushing on, they may be able to accept and feel accepted by American culture. So, phase three is a rough one, guys, and sometimes it's hard to push through that. But if they can make it to phase four where they feel some level of being comfortable and they feel like, they're kind of getting the hang of the new changes, and they can kind of navigate the new culture and new way of life that they are immersed in. And then finally, phase five is called the reverse culture shock. So phase five only happens if someone is immersed in a culture for an extended period of time. So, like, if you were just visiting a country for a month, maybe you would experience a little bit of phase five, but this is usually if you're in a new country for a long period of time. And this is actually when culture shock starts happening in the reverse. So, a visitor to a country or a refugee may become so familiar with their new country and like get so used to that way of life that they would then feel unfamiliar to the culture in their home country. So they've gotten so used to the new culture that their old culture might feel unfamiliar to them. So you can see that culture shock is hard. It's hard, especially for refugees who come from places so different to the United States. So the Lost Boys, when they came to the US, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. It was hard, and they went through some major culture shock. So, to get a little taste of that and to better understand what Salva and the other Lost Boys went through, I have this video down here. So, for today's assignment, you will need to watch this 5-minute video. And what this video shows is a group of South Sudanese refugees who have lived in America, and it just kind of shows how they try to navigate their new surroundings. So, you need to watch this video, and then there are 3 questions here at the bottom that you need to answer in a text box. So answer these 3 questions in a text box. This assignment is due April 24th, which is Friday by 11:59 p.m. If you have any questions about this assignment, or you have questions about culture shock at all, feel free to contact me by email. I'm pretty available through that. So all right, have a good one, guys. Thanks.